Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. Today is Friday, and this is the day we do Mythbusters, and our co-host is Chris Rosini. Chris, welcome to the program.
Good morning, Dr. Paul.
Well, good to have you today, and I understand we're going to be talking about trade or something along those lines.
Yes. Protectionism and mercantilism are in vogue again, unfortunately, and there's always a litany of excuses, so we're going to go over the excuses as to why people want to use government force to their advantage. The first excuse is they want fair trade. And Dr. Paul, it's self-evident that when two people voluntarily trade with one another at a market price, that it's by definition fair. But protectionists say they're not against trade per se, but they want government force to create what they think is a fair conditions for their trade. Can you please explain that?
Yeah, who's against fair trade? That's what liberty is all about, is being fair. But when you have to invite the government in to tell us what fair trade is, you know, the protectionism is a big thing, and there's all forms of it. You know, you can have tariffs, you can have currency wars, you can have sanctions, and all kinds of things. We'll try to go over the various different ways that governments interfere. But it's always nice to come up with a nice slogan about fair, everything's fair. Who's not for fairness and equality? You know, everybody likes those terms. But the fairest way we can have trade would be just to allow the people to make all their own decisions. And, you know, this goes back to a fallacy in economics. Originally, and this is, you know, not tremendously long time since they sorted this all out. You know, hundreds of years ago, they didn't understand. They used to believe that one person's gain is another person's loss. So if I buy something from you, you lost something and I gained. And then it finally dawned on them that if you and I come together on an agreement and we buy and sell and we transfer the goods, both of us gain. You get the money and I get the goods. I'm happy and you're happy. So all of a sudden, you know, that sounds pretty fair to me. But what has happened is that there's been so much interference and all kinds of interference in this voluntarism that was created by government and special interests. And the only thing they can do now is not going back to this principle of voluntarism. They go and say, well, how are we going to use government force to bring about these changes? So they've come up with this concoction of free trade. And actually, free trade, fair trade is associated so often with managed trade, you know, WTO and world government and NAFTA, because they want it to be fair. Yeah, we believe in free trade, but it has to be fair. So you need the bureaucrats involved to decide who's going to get a fair shake, and that usually goes to the big corporation. So fair trade is a trick. If anybody truly wants fair trade, what they want is free trade in the true sense of the word, where people get to do something that is very important in fairness and in liberty. That you, the individual, always gets the right to spend your money the way you see fit and not directed by government rules and regulations and taxations and then also regulating whether you buy overseas and deciding who the winners and who the losers are. That's a long way from the voluntarist approach. You say, well, sometimes it doesn't seem to work out if we can buy too many goods from overseas. Doesn't that hurt our companies? Might. But you have to ask, was it the government's fault? They gave too many problems to that company? Then if it's the case, get rid of those problems. What if it's shoddy products? What if we're not competing properly and doing a good job? Then we have to change that. But there's too often the variable in there that is always going back and forth on is the government interfering, creating the problem, and too many people resorting and say, hey, this isn't working. We want fairness, and then they want more government regulations, and then the people who with the most clout get the benefits. That's the concept we have to challenge and try to get people to understand that fair trade can be achieved through free trade. Matter of fact, that's the only way you can do it, and it's only the way you can give fairness to the individual, to depend it on a moral principle that when you work, it's your life, it's your liberty, it's the fruits of your labor, and you ought to have the right to spend that the way you see fit, rather than saying, well, you can spend it on these goods but not other goods, and we don't want you to buy goods from overseas, that sort of thing. So I'm all for fair trade, but my idea of a fair trade is not the ones who chant fair trade, and demanding tariffs and other controls on international trade.
Yes, the next very popular excuse, and it's a strange one, but it's popular. It's this idea that America is constantly exporting jobs. Now, are we supposed to believe that government owns all the jobs in America and that it is losing these jobs? Or perhaps, Dr. Paul, if you could explain, perhaps it's government regulations and restrictions that force Americans to take their jobs, not the government's jobs, somewhere else where it's the grass is greener.
Yeah, and the jobs leave because of default, because we haven't provided the right conditions to make our companies competitive. And traditionally, America has been pretty good at being competitive, but we've drifted a long way from that because we've rejected these principles of real free trade and voluntarism. But there's also another factor. You have overtaxation, over-regulations that you mentioned, but also there's a currency involvement here because some of our jobs go overseas because of our ability to print the world currency, and then we get a better deal because we print the money, and it's cheaper for us to buy goods overseas, and then obviously jobs are going to go overseas. And that is the other problem that we have. But in this exportation, you don't really export jobs. They leave for very specific reasons, and it's demanding that things get changed in order to fix things. But we even have some laws that compounds this, and the one law is the Overseas Investment Corporation, and that is that if a company goes overseas and they're in a place where there's economic problems and there's financial problems, they can get insurance from the taxpayers that we bail them out to have these jobs overseas. It makes no sense whatsoever. And also, there is a saying that our military follows our industries, and the globalists especially like this idea. They don't want, the individual countries and states to be involved, and so they like the jobs, to go over, but to actually insure them makes no sense whatsoever. And then to send our military and say, don't mess with our companies or our resources. Our oil supplies are to be protected by our company. So then we get involved with foreign policies that actually goes and does things that enhances and eliminates some of the problems overseas. If there's a country that doesn't do a very good job at maintaining order, and a good reason why you shouldn't invest there, well, that's not our responsibility. It's not the American taxpayers to get rid of their problems in order for us to buy more stuff from that country. That should be sorted out in a different way. So yes, one mistake leads to another, but if people resort to this idea that we export jobs, that's a careless use of terms. Yes, jobs do leave because of currency problems, spending problems, tax problems, subsidy problems, our foreign policy. All these things contribute to the distortion of voluntary trade. And if people understood this, they would come across much more supportive of the principles, the true principles of free trade and voluntarism, and allowing people to buy goods and services from wherever they want.
The next argument that we hear is for anti-dumping laws. Now, foreign buyers, they're great. Buy all of our stuff, buy all our American goods. Foreign sellers, on the other hand, they're supposed to be villains. We're supposed to set up barriers to stop them from dumping their goods in our country. We obviously can't buy things cheaply. What's wrong with this line of thinking?
Well, a lot of that goes on, and the argument is that they're dumping something they have too much of. But the real issue is the prices are better. And then they say, oh, and it is true. These other countries may be subsidizing them and the prices are lower. Shouldn't we be, hysterical over that and say, let's not mess with them. Their government's subsidizing these companies. Well, yes, it would be good to point it out, but we don't have control over that. But we shouldn't be terrified at a government or another country if they can produce goods better than we can, cheaper, or even if they get a subsidy, we shouldn't say, well, we're going to close them off. It's unfair. And in a way it is, but it's not harmful. So let's say that the government does give us subsidies and they have to pay for it and they lower the price. Actually, it's a blessing in disguise because we get to buy these goods. What if they get to sell automobiles 25% cheaper than the same automobile if we sell here? And that's not happening right now, but say that's the case and you save 25%. That means you get a good car, maybe even a better car, and you have 25% of your money left over, and you can use that some way to improve your standard of living. But it's much easier to see this in a narrow sense that they're cheating and they're getting a subsidy, and the answer is that we have to keep them from dumping it, and then we go and we put laws against them. And that's what it's all about. They say, well, that's why we have managed trade, is to make sure these companies and countries don't do that. But when they do it, they do it literally thousands of times. There's tariffs and things and restraints put on because they're dumping. But people should look into it and think, dumping is a little bit different than it sounds, and it sounds like some conspiracy. But if it's selling products at a cheaper price, just think of the clothing industry. For various reasons, we won't go into that, is why we lost the clothing business industry. Some of it's actually coming back, but we lost it. So if you have clothing that you can buy at 20% of what it would cost, if we said you can't dump your clothing in this country, what would you do to the poor people in this country? I mean, it's a tremendous increase in the standard of living that clothing comes into this country, and it's very, very cheap in comparison to what it would be like if we say no more clothing can come into this country, and we will have it made here. And like I said, some of that is coming back, but they have to be competitive. And one thing that is compensating for the artificially high wages will be robots, and it will come back and be more competitive. But this idea that you have to stop dumping, if they're making available to us legitimate goods that we would ordinarily buy and we want, and the price is way low, don't write it off as, oh, they're those evil people, they're dumping stuff on it. Oh, what they're doing is providing it. And the other factor that we have to think about at times is some of this occurs, with the currency wars, the artificial rigging of currency values, which we do all the time, but then we claim, oh, it's all China's fault. But making the currency lower, it makes imports a little cheaper, and people think that is the solution. So that's a war that goes on all the time, and that's why eventually, if you want really good free trade, you have a sound currency that is acceptable and in a way universal, like it was when you had the gold standard, because you can't manipulate the exchange rate of gold. You can manipulate the paper currencies for so-called trading advantages, but you can't manipulate the value of gold. And that means that it would iron out a lot of these problems that we face today, because actually these problems of trade are building. They're getting much worse.
Okay, the final excuse, we actually saw it this week. There are two magic words that government loves to use, and that's national security. If they want to erect barriers for national security, they know automatically Americans are going to listen. We're told it's intended to hurt our enemies' leaders. It actually does the opposite. So please talk about the national security excuse.
Yeah, in Congress, you're supposed to roll over if you say national security, and most members do. And that's why they essentially all, vote for sanctions, except for the very few. And they just roll over because for national security reasons, we have to punish this country, and vice versa. So, but But this whole idea of interference in trade in a ruthless manner has been around for a long time and is closely related to war. If you have trade wars, eventually it leads to real wars. And oftentimes if you have a real war, it will lead to trade wars. You will lead to blockades and barriers and all kinds of controls. But my goal has always been to point out that the careless use and the determined use of putting on sanctions and controlling trade leads to war, and that's where we are today. So national security, they'll say it's for national security, but really national security is threatened by this. You know, the sanctions that we put on Cuba for 50, 60 years didn't do any good. They didn't really result in anything, and we still argue, and the argument that we should continue those continues. And then if some trade occurring, you know, either with Iran or Russia or something, people get hysterical, say, oh no, we can't do it, they're our enemies, and it goes on, and they have to stop it. So the issue of sanctions come up. But sanctions, in a way, they are a blockade, and they should be rejected as an act of war, because we wouldn't like it if all of a sudden there were sanctions and a blockade and a prohibition of the import of some of our goods and services to this country. And that would be that would excite a lot of people. So I think we make a serious mistake. But if you think about this type of thing in national security and national trade, it's been going on for a long time. Just think of the argument between the colonists and the British. You know, the chief smuggler who became very wealthy because he didn't believe in all those tariffs and those issues was John Hancock. And he became very wealthy, and of course he was a champion of the revolution, but he was looking for real free trade, you know, but he was trying to get around all the tariffs. But even our Civil War, you know, we have been taught that there was only one issue in our Civil War, and that was slavery. But that was an add-on. The reason the Civil War basically started in South Carolina had to do with tariffs, and it was at a port, and it was the argument that the North was benefiting by tariffs on the South, and it had to be stopped. So that led to a major conflict. And this so often is the problem, that when you put on these sanctions, it will lead to more problems. So here we now are facing a situation where in the last several weeks, there's been this tremendous effort to punish Russia, and therefore make sure that Trump doesn't advance with his softness on Russia, which we don't know exactly where he is on there, but they thought he was way too soft on Russia, so the warmongers had to put him on. It overwhelmingly said we have to punish Russia, which I find sort of interesting politically speaking. You know, we've had an election, the Democrats lost, and it wasn't the Democrats' fault. It was the fault of the Russians. The Russians interfered and they rigged our election, and we have to investigate this and prove this. And of course, the Democrats want to prove that they really stole the election, and the Republicans basically, you know, take the other position, but not on a principled position. They say, well, no, they really did. But what do? They decide to punish the Russians for rigging the election. They come along and this is sort of guilty until proven innocent. So the Republicans, by voting for this and championing it, is saying, you know, the Russians are really bad people. They come in and interfere with our election. They totally ignore the whole argument about how this whole mess came up with Ukraine and the trade with us being involved in the coup in Ukraine. That's totally ignored because the hawks in the Republican Party, they don't want to admit this. So they want to be tough on Russia, but in doing this, they sort of confess up, well, it was the Russians, they rigged this election. So it goes on and on. So they put on these sanctions, and it looks like now it will be signed, even though Trump, even if he did veto it, it would be overridden. And it's just out of meanness that they do this. It has no benefits. There's going to be so many unintended consequences. I compare this vote and this bill going to be as significant as Smoot-Hawley. Smoot-Hawley didn't cause the depression, but it didn't help and made things worse. The Federal Reserve creates depressions. But protectionism and tariffs will make things work. This is not exactly a tariff, but it's a penalty, and it's being put on. And guess what? The people who were on the side of the coup that created so many of our problems, the European Union and NATO, they're getting a little bit worried about these sanctions on Russia because they have some deals going in that might hurt their economy. So they're backing off, and they say, hey, wait a minute, United States, you're going too fast and too far, and we don't want this. And also they're saying that, you know, if you do this, there's going to be a serious ramification. And the Russians, you know, compared to us, they're a poor country, but they're determined, and they're not going to be pushed around easily, and they're capable of doing it. And we have done some things that deserve criticism, like taking some diplomatic property, and they have some truth on their side of the argument, and they're saying they're not going to put up with it. So the whole world economy is just very precarious because it's built on a global idea of fiat currencies that have been created to umpteen trillions of dollars, and the only thing holding it together is a trust in that system. So print more money, print more money. So though the stock markets are high, believe me, it is not a reflection of the great prosperity of our people or any people around the world. And the consequence of the wars in the Middle East and the migration problems that has caused a great deal of disturbance in Europe, those problems have made the world very fragile. So if we come in now and not talking about real free trade and a sound currency and lower taxes and liberty for the individual, we're talking about something big happening, and something like these sanctions to me seems to be equal to, and hopefully not worse than what Smoot-Hawley was, but it's some of these unintended consequences that come along, and they'll read about if this happened, you know, in 10 years from now, and they'll say, why did those guys do this? Why did they vote for this? A lot of people now say, how could the Republicans and the Democrats vote for these tariffs in the 1930s? Didn't they know better? But, you know, they do this because it's superficial, it's political, it's out of ignorance, and they have bought into most of the arguments of Keynesianism. Debt doesn't matter. Deficits don't matter. If you have problems, you stimulate the economy by spending. So just get out of our way. And if we're threatened by foreign entities like the Iranians are coming. The Iranians are coming. You know, and there's almost a universal idea that we have to crack down on them. And then also, you know, Korea's not an easy country to defend, and I wouldn't want to defend them, but I want to defend America by saying we don't need to provoke a conflict in Korea. It's not necessary to provoke a conflict in the Korean Peninsula for our national security. It endangers us. It costs money, too. And we don't need to provoke any more problems with the Iranians. That doesn't help us in any way. And who in the world thinks that provoking a conflict with Russia makes any sense whatsoever? So I would say if people had a much better understanding of what true freedom is all about, true free trade is all about, why protectionism in all its flavors doesn't add to the economy, it creates more trouble for us. And we're at a crossing point right now on which way we're going to go. And in case I think most people who listen to my program here know exactly where I stand, because I stand on the side of liberty and freedom of trade, which means that you have a right to your life, you have a right to your liberty, you have a right to create your own prosperity, and you ought to have a right to spend your money, and that means you would be more open to friendship and trade and getting along with people at the same time, being able to provide a national defense if there was an enemy there that we had to, confront. But that's my little say about free trade and protectionism, Chris, and I want to thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Paul.
Good, and I want to thank our audience for joining us today on Mythbusters. Please come back soon to the Liberty Report.